Higher education today is it's a huge industry. You know, over $200 billion is spent with just federal tax money alone to support higher education. And when you add that, the cost of tuition fees and private influx of money, we're talking about a billions and billions of dollar a year business.
People forget that higher education is one of the largest industries in the United States.
Well, it's huge. The problem is it's loosely coupled. That one institution doesn't necessarily do what another institution, but it would appear as though they're all doing the same.
And the variety of institutions, from technical colleges, community colleges, branch campuses, main campuses, small privates, small publics, the variety is just huge. People forget about that.
It does. And 20 million people are enrolled in higher education programs right now, and for the next 10 years, it's projected that number will increase.
The federal government, states governments are all trying to get us you need more students, you need to graduate more students. And higher education is just, in reality, kind of sitting around doing the same thing it's always done.
And that's the problem. That's the problem. Times have changed, people have changed, but it seems as though the same paradigm that was in place 350 years ago in this country is still the same for higher education.
And you hear these words like climb to the top, striving for the top. In reality, I think for most campuses, we're kind of striving towards the middle.
Probably at best.
At best. And one of my disappointments as an educator all these years is the fact that we're really not trying to do all that we can be. We do a great job. We do an admirable job. I was well educated. Pretty much everybody I know is well educated. But how much better can it be?
Well, that would be the question. But before we can answer that, we have to determine how good it is right now.
You mean there's not a lot of data, Mark?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data at all. And I think one of the primary problems is, it goes right back to the beginning, what is higher education supposed to be? Now, you can ask anybody that question and they'll be able to answer. And what do you think they'll tell you?
Graduation rates.
And what else?
Graduation rates.
And what else?
I have no idea what people will say.
It really depends on your perspective. If you're an administrator, you'll say graduation rates. Or if you're an admissions counselor, you say get them in the front door. But we're talking about taking a big step back and asking the question, trying to answer the question, what is higher education all about? What is it supposed to be? And what we'll hear is, you ask a student and they'll say, well, I want to get a good job as a result. And ask their parents and they'll say, well, we want our child to get a good job. Ask an educator and they'll say the job of higher education is to educate and improve students. But these are all ambiguous terms at best.
And some of them are hard to measure and some are quite easy to measure. One of the things that's been exciting in the last 15 or 20 years is the increase in trying to assess student learning outcomes. But this is kind of reserved to, can your math majors do mathematics? Can your English majors do English? Can your geography majors do geography? And there's a whole raft of things that we've always kind of assumed education does, like leadership education, citizenship education, diversity education, relationship education. These are orphan outcomes, and they don't really get looked at a lot.
Well, let me ask a question. Who says those are important?
I do.
And who else?
I mean, that's a good question. And it goes back to the one you asked previously, what is education about? So there are a lot of discussions about, what should education be? In reality, a college degree is sitting in 40 classes, 3 hours a week, passing them with a C. We'll give you a diploma for that.
And in the end, if it is graduate more students, success is considered anybody who graduates with a 2.0 GPA.
After sitting in 40 classes.
And the required number of credit hours.
Right.
Well, this is what essentially led to our initial investigation. We had to ask, what is it higher education should be? And if you'll recall, that long process of asking people across the nation, from business leaders to politicians to civic leaders to educators themselves, what is it that college education should be? And we come up with a decidedly different answer than just graduation.
And it was a fun summer. And I think the thing that surprised me most when I look back on those conversations is the consistency that we got. No matter who we asked, did the same kind of things. I mean, remember we asked, what was it? When a student walks across the stage at graduation, what do you want them to know or be able to do?
There we go.
And we got that consistent answer time and time again. You went into the literature, and that was reflected in the literature, but then you go to the campuses and look at what they're doing, and it's not reflected
It's
there.
a decidedly different story.
Decidedly different story.
So let's go over what we found in our research is what the internal and external communities to higher education say it should include. It should be the development of critical thinking skills,
Excellent.
self-awareness,
Yep.
communication skills,
Oral, verbal, using PowerPoint,
all types.
using media.
all types, an appreciation and an understanding of diversity. It moves to citizenship.
Always a good thing, and we'll get to this a little later, I'm sure, but always disappoints me is when that's one of the lowest scores we get from students.
Consistency the lowest, and it has been for the last 6-7 years of data collection.
But not for all groups, and we'll get to that.
We'll get to that too. And the other two domains are membership/leadership, because it's really one in the same when we look at the phenomenon.
Everybody studies leadership, but not a lot of people look enough closely. Any organization's got far more members than it has leaders.
Well, you bet.
And there's a skill to be a member, and there's a skill to be a leader.
Absolutely. And finally, the domain of relationships. So we have 7 domains, broad domains, that the world is saying higher education should attend to these. But as you said before, higher education is really attending to, if you really look at the paradigm and what it does, it's focused almost entirely on the classroom experience with academic content, driven by the academic major the student chooses, and sprinkled with some general education for a broader learning, but still academic content.
Do you remember the day I called you after we had done our first pilot? We had data on 300 and something students, and did our first analysis to find out, do these scales work that we've developed? And it was just such an exciting day. I mean, we knew that, of course, relationships is interrelated with diversity, and these are all intercorrelated. And we knew that. But it was so exciting when the numbers came out as well as they did. I mean, I've got a background in ed measurement, as you do. It was just so exciting to see how well we had done. But really, I credit the people who talked to us over that summer and said relationships. And then when we asked them, well, when they walk across the stage, what do you want them to know or be able to do in relationships? And just listening to them writing the items was remarkably consistent.
I recall when we were speaking to a group at a major flagship institution in the state, and we put the same question to them as we did in our initial research, and we wrote the answers on the board, on a whiteboard, and on the other side of the flip whiteboard, we had already written the 7 domains. And when we flipped it over, their answers to compare with what the research had found, there was such consistency. So people are thinking the same thing. Now, talking just a little bit about the instrument, we have the University Learning Outcomes Assessment, what we call the Uniloa. It's built to measure levels of student behavior all across these 7 domains, with the assumption that if students are engaging meaningful behaviors in these areas, they should be learning as a result of them.
Do you remember when we started to develop the list of demographic questions, what we thought might be related to this? What were the kinds of experiences they had on campus? What are the kinds of inputs that they were coming in with, like gender and parental education and all this? And it was like choosing the astronauts. We had no notion really of what were going to be the great questions. We looked at the literature, of course, to see what the literature said. But I think we started out with 23 demographic questions or something, and then shortened it and shortened it and shortened it.
Down pretty quickly.
But it was fairly clear and fairly obvious what are the kinds of experiences that affect students and are related to higher scores. And then, as we found later, as we got more data from more groups, other kinds of experiences that we hadn't asked about turned out to be really interesting.
You bet. Now begs the question, why isn't anybody listening?
Because everything's okay. And again, this is the striving towards the middle. And I'm not being pejorative. I think we've got a wonderful system that works extremely well. We have the system that is model for much of the world. We're the net importer of people to come to college in the United States. But I think about how great it could be. People seem to be satisfied with this really pretty good system.
Well, I think I'll challenge you a little bit, because I think you're referring to how good it is to maintain its present level of, and would it be unfair to say, mediocrity? I mean, the harsh reality is across this nation, we have a graduation rate, and this is a 6-year graduation rate of college students. Only 55% of people who start college actually finished. I translate that as we have a 45% mortality rate in higher education in this country. And that, to me, if we look, as I said at the beginning, billions of dollars invested in the higher education enterprise with a mortality rate of almost half, I think this country should be in arms saying this is intolerable.
This is money not necessarily being well spent. And you hear from the politicians and education leaders that we need more college graduates in the country. And years ago, we were the envy of the world. We have about 30% of the U.S. population over 29 with a 4-year college degree. You want to throw in a 2-year college degree, that number goes up. And other countries have kind of caught up to us. There seems to be this point for developed nations of about 29 to 31% college graduates. There are two answers to get more college graduates. One is to get more in the door, which is, okay, that's one way to do it. And the other is to look at this mortality rate of the students who aren't graduating. How can we get that 45% to graduate? Now, campuses that are taking the top student in every school, they don't need to worry about that. They're going to graduate.
The ones with 85% graduation
95%.
rates.
And my question is, why don't you have 100%? That's another discussion.
But on the other side, we have community colleges, a lot of online private institutions, open access institutions that can have graduation rates as low as 15, 18%.
And if you look at a lot of states, the flagship institution will have a really nice graduation rate. But when you look at the branch campuses, that's a different story. And when you average those numbers out across all the branch campuses and the institutions, people pretty much begin to look like 55%.
So how fair is it to say that the current prevailing higher education paradigm isn't working as well as we would like?
It's working just fine for the 55% who graduate.
For what we're getting. Now let's look at that 55% that graduate, because nowhere in the conversation do we hear about the quality of those graduates.
No, they've passed all their classes.
We can go right back down to the C average and 100-some credit hours.
I think one of the best metaphors I heard from a student was, it's a baseball season. You go to a class, you win the class because you get enough hits, you move on to the next game. Games are unrelated in the season to them, and once you win enough games, you get to graduate.
There we go.
That's not the vision, I think, that we as educators have of education as an integrated whole, as teaching across the curriculum. I think we need to revisit a lot of those discussions. I know that's happening on a regular basis. A lot of schools are looking at that.
But the problem is there's a lot of conversation and not a whole lot of doing.
You mean it's like politics? There's a lot of ideology and not much data?
Now, let's be careful there. Let's make one more comment before we close this first segment. If the higher education paradigm isn't working beyond 55% success rate, who's at fault?
Well, if I go out fishing and the fish aren't biting, I could blame the fish or I could blame me. In fact, it's an interaction effect. You need to put out better bait and fish in the right spots, et cetera, et cetera. But there are differences in good fishermen, fisherwomen, and bad. I'm on the bad side. I go out and drown a worm.
And that's where we'll set up, leading to our next series, leading up to the next presentation in this series. Thank you.